Women, there were obviously more men than women, and so very few women were unmarried because women were a prized commodity. Men tended to want wives and children, and so women had lots and lots of offers. The average colonial woman was 20 at the age of her first marriage, and this was actually probably distorted because indentures were not allowed to marry. If indentures would have been allowed to marry, this number would have been well down into the teens. Premarital sex was common because indentures weren't allowed to marry, but of course they're people and that's going to happen. And so you had lots and lots and lots of babies born out of wedlock. Now, if an indentured servant has a baby and they're not married, the owner then takes that baby, the master of the indentured servant, and forces that baby to be an indentured servant until they reach a certain age. And so many children were born into indentured. In New England, you have a much more balanced sex ratio, and the death rate is far lower. There's more families. They did marry young, and they did have lots of children, but the children lived at the children were less likely to die, I should say, as well as the husbands. It is true, though, that your spouse tended to be chosen by, or at least approved of, by your father, because the man would give land to the new couple so they could live their life. And if the man didn't like who you married, they wouldn't give you land, or they would give you very little land, and you wouldn't be able to support yourself. And so this really flowed through the male of the family on who married who. Women got dowries. The man was expected to pay money to the future husband for marrying his daughter, or give land. And there was a lot fewer babies born out of wedlock. The wife and the mother were greatly honored in the New England tradition. They said lots of nice things about them and talked about how great mom was, but she was given no power. The man had complete control of the family, made all the decisions, could beat his kids if he wanted to. Women weren't allowed to decline sex to their husband, and all those sorts of things. So that was mostly lip service. Take a minute now and talk about slaves in the colonies, the early days. A significant amount of slaves were not even available for trade until the middle of the 1600s, which works out fairly well because it'll be in the 1670s that the colonists decide to reject indentured servitude and embrace slavery. Slaves in America tended to come from the Caribbean. They did not tend to come directly from Africa. Over time, the slave trade became larger and larger and more inhumane. The original slaves were actually treated very much like indentures. In fact, in the beginning, they were released after a period of time to freedom. But of course, that changes. Over 11 million Africans were brought to the Americas as slaves. Now, and you'll see, if you look at this map here, that America received a small portion of those. Only about 5% of all the slaves brought to America ever came to the colonies. The bulk of these slaves went to places like Brazil and the Caribbean. And you may be aware that the Caribbean and Brazil are filled with African Americans even today because of this. The slave trade began due to the African American practice of enslaving criminals and prisoners of war. I shouldn't say African American, I'm sorry, the African practice of enslaving criminals of war and prisoners. Like all societies, they enslaved their own. The white people did this to white people, Native Americans did this to Native Americans. But the difference here is that when the Portuguese came to the area, they began trading with the Africans, and one of the commodities that they traded were slaves. And slaves proved to be so popular that the Portuguese decided to cut out the middleman and just start kidnapping the Africans directly and bringing them over. And so that's how this begins. It's called the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the New World. If you think about that triangular trade we talked about, New World to Europe, Europe to Africa, Africa to New World, we call this the Middle Passage because it's thought of as the second leg on this journey. Now, the Middle Passage could be incredibly inhumane. There were some ship captains who believed in shoving as many slaves as they could onto a boat, not really doing anything to take care of them, and just selling whoever survived and throwing the dead bodies overboard. Although there were ships where they did attempt to keep all the slaves alive and healthy, but that's not really any better because you still end up being a slave, right? Up until 1697, the Royal African Company, this is a British corporation, controlled the trade of slaves into the American colonies. But in 1697, competitors were able to break this monopoly, and the supply of slaves increased dramatically, and the price of slaves also dropped dramatically. And so this is when we really begin to see a huge influx of slaves into the New World. In the South, in some areas, blacks outnumbered whites 2 to 1. So 2 blacks for every one white. Originally, I can't remember if I said this, but slaves were indentures. They were released after a time. But after Bacon's Rebellion, the idea of releasing a slave became unacceptable. Racism developed to justify slavery. I think we often assume that slavery was based on racism. That's not true. Racism is based on slavery. If you believe these people are human beings just like you and me, then it becomes very morally difficult to enslave them. But if you develop a worldview that they're somehow inferior, savage animals, then you can justify enslaving them. So racism is created to make everybody feel better about slavery, not the other way around. In the early 1700s, slave codes will begin to be passed in the states, making separate laws governing blacks and whites. And these, of course, are going to limit what blacks' rights. And sometimes people are asked, I've been asked, how black was black? How much black blood did you need to have in you to be considered an African and therefore be subject to the slave codes? And the answer to that is 1 drop. Any black blood at all. If you're 95% white, 5% black, you're black. And so that's worth understanding. So here in America, we're having this collision of the red, the white, and the black, the Native American, the European, and the African. But also we have to understand that non-English folks begin coming, people who do not come from England. A group of French Protestants called the Huguenots, about 300,000 of them, will flee repression. 3,000 German Protestants will come, and they will move to, for the most part, to Pennsylvania. And if you ask a German, what are you? Are you German? They'll say Deutsch, because the word in German for Germany is Deutschland. And so these people are mislabeled by locals as Dutch, because Deutsch sounds like Dutch. And these people today are called the Pennsylvania Dutch, even though they're not Dutch, they're German. The Scotch-Irish will also come and move into the coastal areas, particularly, really all up and down the coast, but particularly in the south. The Scotch-Irish are the Scottish people who were used by England to try to take over Ireland. And then they moved from Ireland to here, but their ancestry goes back to Scotland. The Scottish bring Presbyterianism, which is a form of Protestantism, as well as Catholics. They're also Catholic Scots, to Carolina. And we also begin to see the movement of the Irish to America, although that's going to be much more intense in the 1800s, also bringing Catholicism as well. And so we begin to see America becoming more diverse, not only because of an increase in slavery, but also an increase of various national groups and religious groups from Europe.